Well, now that we've had Jason speak and basically point out that practically speaking we don't have to worry about this clause, I do want to say that from an academic point of view and from a socio-political point of view, I find the inclusion of the supremacy of God to be, appalling. That they would trivialize such an important document as this with the addition of that term. And I think it would be far more becoming of them if they had, instead of putting, whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, if they changed it to, whereas Canada is founded upon the principles that separation of church and state and the rule of law, that would be far more accurate, because the rule of law portion of it is very important to our history, to the way we have developed as a country. And so by putting the supremacy of God next to rule of law, it's contradictory, because the rule of law has been a fundamental principle of how our state has evolved to control itself. The Old English realized that if you simply let the monarch do what they want, things bad can happen. And a concept developed over the centuries that the courts ultimately have the power, under the common law, to tell the king he's wrong at certain times and to protect the individuals, such as the right to writ of habeas corpus, where if the state arrests somebody, that the court has the power to say, look, king, you have to produce that body and justify why you have taken that body, that person, into custody and detained them. You can't just grab somebody from their home, from their families, and throw them in jail, and because you're the king. There is a power of the court that's above the king. It's the rule of law, which says that the court can say, if there is no justification under our common law for you to take that person from his home and put him in your prison, then you're going to have to answer to us for it and justify it. And so that was one of the early rights, was the writ of habeas corpus, which was by common law power of the judiciary to go and take back the body and make the state account for why they took that person and imprison them. So there's a history to it that's very important. Now, British were evolving, and there was also at the same time that they had the common law courts, which protected the rule of law, they also had the ecclesiastic courts. And the ecclesiastic courts protected the church interests. And in history, they were eventually abolished, but before they were abolished, a lot of mischief happened, which taught people, social historians, philosophers, the intellectuals of the 1600s and 1700s, made them realize the importance of the separation of church and state. And the most common example was what happened to Galileo. Was brought before the ecclesiastic courts of the time, the Inquisition, and in England it's called the ecclesiastic courts, in Italy it was something else. And because the church did not believe that the earth was the center of the universe, and because Galileo was teaching the world that it was his belief that the earth was not the center of the universe, they decided to imprison him for life for this blasphemous thought. And they not only did that, the more important, the more serious thing that they did from the point of view of society and history is they banned his works from being published and being taught anywhere. And not just what Galileo had said about where the earth is relative to the sun. They banned all his works from being taught. Now, for those among us who know the importance of science, science builds on the scientists before us. There's building blocks that are built intellectually, where our great scientists that preceded us developed formulas, and then the scientists that follow build on those formulas. And that's why we have the technological wonders which we have right now. That's where society has evolved to the state where it can provide the massive amount of wealth for people through technology and productivity. I mean, it's critical to our development that we have the freedom of science to be able to develop what we have. Now, what was happening in the Middle Ages was the church had the power through the ecclesiastical courts and through its involvement in the state to pick and choose science and outlaw it outright. They basically had this monopoly, this control over science, which they should never have had. And that's something we have learned in history should never have happened, that there should never be that power of church to to influence and to control our lives in that way. Because that science, which Galileo was definitely one of the greatest scientists of that time, in the late 1500s, in the early 1600s. And for his works to be banned from being taught, all of them, was just an outrage. So the scientists that followed, around that same time, there was this new country being formed, and it was America. And when America was being scratched out of the ground and developed for the first time, they had the memory of what happened to people like Galileo. They had the memory of what happens when church has any involvement in state. And they realized that this society that they're going to build is not going to have that happen. And America has become a technological wonderland. It has developed in a way that no other country has ever been able to develop. And I believe that is directly related to the fact that we have not allowed despots or church to dominate our political affairs in any way. We've kept that separation. And that is a fundamental principle that this country was built on, was separating church from the state and the rule of law, which put the judiciary above the state in certain circumstances to protect individual rights. In fact, right now we have Harper. He's complaining about the fact every chance he can about judge-made law. Those judges, how dare they tell us rewrite the law? You know, we can't have them making judge-made law. Well, that's the rule of law at work. So, you know, this clause, though it's in the whereas clause, and some people might think, well, it's insignificant. You know, nobody ever turns to the whereas clause. It is a fundamental principle of what this country is built on, and it is at work every day. Similarly, the separation of church and state deserves that same status. And even though some people, as Jason said trying to remove it is, you know, well, it's not going to make any difference. It at least will remind people that during the debate over it, why we have it, why we have separation of church and state. It might be a useful way to educate young people as to the importance of why we have the society we have and what important principles we learned in the past of separating the church and state. And, you know, it's not so distant in the past now. I mean, it's 10, 15 years ago, I would have said, well, you know, we're long past that. The church will never rear its ugly head and control state again. But we do see it in some ways. I mean, they're basically, you know, religion is trying to hijack the social institution of marriage. And I'm a family lawyer, and I know what marriage is about. I deal with it every time. And I think the whole concept of, to say that, when I heard recently that the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Christians got together, their councils, and they all agree that homosexuals should not be allowed to marry. Well, that's appalling for them to even think they have the right to say that, because it's a social institution that's separate from church, and that they have no say in it. But they don't see it that way. And just the fact that they're even given lip service to be able to say that, and to somehow assume that they have control over that institution, it's appalling. But sometimes they forget that they don't have a role in the state, and these institutions are separate from them, and their religious views should not be imposed on others, and they don't own marriage and the rest of it. But yet we are in a state where suddenly people are forgetting why we kept those separate, why we keep the church and state separate, and they actually considered bringing back Sharia law in Ontario, allegedly in situations where the parties consent. And that's where it might serve as a useful reminder by this group or others that we should be keeping that clear separation. It's historically important. It is what a principle that this country is founded on. Our country wasn't founded on the principle of supremacy of God. What the hell does that mean? You know, any historian would say, well, what? I mean, as a lawyer, you know, where did that come into the development of Canada and the United States? It was the opposite. It was the separation of church, keeping them away. And Europe screwed up badly in the Middle Ages when they allowed the ecclesiastical churches to run the way they did. We've learned separately. So it is a principle that we're built on, to separate the two, not to make God supreme.
Hello, my name is Elsie Dean.